Hello, I'm Professor Sarah Wendt and currently Director of the Social Workers Registration Board here in South Australia. Before I begin the presentation, I would like just to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the beautiful Kaurna people, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I want to acknowledge that social work has a complex history here in Australia because of the impacts of colonisation on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across this country. I want to acknowledge the trauma that has created, but also equally and importantly, I want to acknowledge the long and enduring relationship and connection to country and culture that First Nations people across Australia continue to have today. The purpose of this presentation today is to name challenges and opportunities for the profession of social work as we embark on the registration here in South Australia. I would like to thank the Social Workers Registration Board staff who particularly helped me think this through, particularly Dr. Kate Seymour, Louise Butler, Chris Reynolds and Ruth James. So as a Professor of Social Work with a 25-year career as a social worker in domestic violence, as an academic and researcher and lecturer, and now with the privilege of being the new Director for the registration scheme here in South Australia, what I would like to do is bring observations to this presentation. But also my presentation has been informed by evidence. That is the academic literature, reports in the media, quotes in Hansard. And so if you're interested in my sources, the reference list is also included at the end of the presentation. Now, South Australia is uniquely positioned to actually explore the implications registration has on social work identity and the future of the profession. So in South Australia, the Social Workers Registration Act 2021 actually legislated the establishment of the Social Workers Registration Board to regulate social workers, commencing by proclamation. So regulation focuses on the safety and wellbeing of the public by ensuring only suitably qualified and experienced people can register as social workers, encouraging high standards of conduct and competence. And so in this presentation, I encourage that we continually think about the safety and wellbeing of the public, and I'm going to argue if we are truly committed to this profession, it is now that we need to talk about, think about, and come together to face the challenges of the profession. But more importantly, the opportunities regulation provides us to respond to these contemporary challenges. The public are entitled to a high quality service, particularly in high risk work with the most vulnerable. And with social work stepping into this regulation space, it's our accountability which becomes the focus. So we need to be ready for this accountability. And with that, we need to look at ourselves as a profession and how we build this accountability across education, workplaces and practice. I would also like to note that regulation is not a process that sits outside of the profession. It is a professional responsibility. And it is a professional issue because registration alone cannot improve practice. It also actually requires professional leaders and educators to enable and support the lifting of practice and the employment standards. And so in this presentation, first, I'm going to paint a contemporary picture of the state of social work and the current tensions facing the future of the profession. And then second, I'm going to argue why regulation is so important at this point in time if social work is going to have a sustained future. So before I talk about the challenges, it's important just to position ourselves here in Australia and acknowledge that social work adheres to the International Federation of Social Workers' global definition of social work, describing social work in part as a practice-based profession and an academic discipline that promotes social change and development, social cohesion, and the empowerment and the liberation of people. Now, social work, as we know, work in a broad range of contexts in a variety of roles with diverse areas of responsibility. This is perhaps social work's most defining characteristic and one of its greatest strengths. Social work is, in a sense, sometimes impossible to pin down, defined not by what it does, but what it inspires to do. But it is also profoundly shaped by its contexts. And so when I say contexts, I'm meaning the environments in which social work finds itself. That is, the political, the social cultural, the institutional contexts that actually shape social work. And then this actually has market consequences, or the market responds to these kind of representations. So I want to share this contemporary context with you and how it is shaping the construction of social work and therefore the practice and work of social workers. So what I'm going to do is I want to name how the current political, social, cultural and institutional market contexts are impacting and shaping social work currently in Australia. I share these, let's call them constructions, of social work, not as a truth, not to be alarmist, but as a representation, and a representation that is growing more dominant. I also want to point out that this representation of social work is problematic because it's actually having material consequences that we are seeing play out in higher education institutions and the employment of social workers. And I want to explain these material consequences. So if we take the political and social context in which social work finds itself, there is a strong argument forming that we are experiencing neoliberal structures, new public management practices. We're familiar with the shrinking of state services and familiar with the increase in privatisation as well as the competitive tendering across the social services. So when you look at this, political discourses are driving this. Social cultural discourses are also supporting the embrace of individualism, the what can society do for me? It is all about my rights, with perhaps collectivism and social responsibility becoming more silenced or challenged. We see this playing out in the anti-woke discourses and the questioning of social inequalities about whether they're real or not, or as some say, it's political correctness gone mad. So these discourses, political, social, cultural discourses, then have impacts on educational institutions. For example, most recently in the last couple of years, we are seeing the closing of social science and humanities departments across universities. We see actually the questioning of the role of universities and who is the expert. Or we see the perspective that academia is too slow to respond to the workforce needs. What is a work-ready graduate? And you also then see the rise of private providers offering social work degrees and other degrees to provide an alternative to the work-ready graduates that society and politics seem to be demanding. So social work is shaped by these political, social and institutional discourses. And so in the last 5 years in particular, I have noticed that researchers and academics are commenting on this through research papers in the literature. And here are some of the following themes that you can draw out of this literature. That social work has issues of identity, legitimacy and direction. That social work is in crisis. We are seeing the end of social work. Social work's just complicit in maintaining the status quo because social work has too many historical stains. Social justice is not unique to social work, and social work has no evidence base. It's pawns of the political environment, and people question, what does social work even do? Not only are we seeing this play out in the academic realms, but we are also seeing these themes, unfortunately, playing out in our major media outlets, including most recently, news articles being reported in some of the biggest newspapers here in Australia, with students, even social work students, commenting, and I quote, "Social work classes are very judgmental," or "I do not have to do or write about an acknowledgement of country because this is my country." We are seeing this play out in the media. We see media outlets writing that international students are the cash cows of universities. Most intriguing, in the last year, we've seen media reports that there are high numbers attracted to social work in universities, but at the same time, the highest dropout rates come from social work. And when people look into this, they're questioning social work doesn't live up to the claim of the marketing to be about justice and social change. I too have experienced these political, social and institutional contexts shaping my own experiences. So for me, I have found in the last, a couple of years that teaching gender inequality is becoming harder and harder, with students able to express that they don't believe you and that's their right not to believe you, or students challenging any form of assessment that might trigger them and their own issues. They don't want to work with trauma. Or unfortunately, when I'm out in the sector talking to the major employers, I hear things like social work has a reputation for not failing anyone, or students being advised to go do social work because they won't fail you, or students telling social work academics, I don't want to be a social worker, I'm here for the visa pathway, or anyone being employed to teach social work because, hey, it's not that hard. So political, social and institutional discourses influence this. You can see this playing out in the market, and I've seen it play out in my own lived experiences. This influences the market, and this then influences representations of social work and is having market impacts. Some of these market impacts we can actually see. For example, social work is not considered a specialist area. The discourse of anyone can do social work, or what does social work do anyway, is rising and is strong. You will see social work positions being advertised alongside diplomas or TAFE certificates. This also represents social work in a particular way. Or I'm receiving feedback from the sector that graduates don't understand complexity and they're not ready to work in the field of social work. This has ramifications in how social workers are paid and how they are thought of legally. For example, back in 2024, the ABC actually reported institutionalised underpayment of social services workers is actually rife, with many staff not knowing how much they should be getting paid. Similarly here in 2024 in South Australia's Legislative Council, social work qualifications were referenced in tribunal context, noting a role in guardianship, mental health and administration, but framed as an adjunct to the legal authority because social work is not central to any decision making. I raise these observations not to be alarmist, not to point fingers, but raise an awareness that social work as a profession in Australia is at a crossroads of some sort. There is a disconnect between the vision of the International Federation of Social Work and what is playing out in contemporary society today across politics, culture, education and the market. The vision doesn't seem to be enough anymore. And amongst this, we still have defenders of social work playing out, for example, in our parliament. So here in South Australia, parliamentarians stand up and say, and I will quote, social workers are dedicated, highly skilled and well-qualified professionals who, with compassion, walk alongside people when they face really difficult times and in most need of support. They deserve to be valued and have their profession recognised. I also see this, even across my own lived experience. When someone asks you, what do you do? And you say you're a social worker, you might get, that must be really rewarding, or that would be really hard work. I couldn't do that. So what is happening here? There's value in this work, but it's not translating to the market at the moment. Academics, researchers and employers are trying to say something. They are saying something, and something is shaping social work education and the market drivers. And by trying to deny this, contentious, uncomfortable representations is actually not going to help us, as there are also other constructions being written about social work, including social work talks about itself ad nauseum with an inertia, not changing anything. Will the divisions or the theoretical tensions in social work and the internal disagreements ever be resolved? Some say social work is stuck. It's not addressing what it espouses to address, and it's not getting respect for this. Social work denies its exercise of power, creating confusion and unprofessionalism. Now, you might be thinking, this is nothing new. Social work has battled these constructions for a long time. And I have to say, I too know that. But I'm sensing and I'm noticing a sense of urgency in the literature. I'm sensing and have seen the tensions in education and employment playing out. I also see a political and social shift that's potentially putting an end to social work. And as social work writers observe, there is an inertia surrounding social work. And if we are not careful or interested in this inertia, that is social work that's surrounding us, I'm afraid we will disappear. So what I'm saying is, social work is the only one that can respond to this so-called crisis or this inertia and change these constructions, or the shifting political, social, institutional and market terrains will actually do it for us. So how do we make social work matter? How do we make our values, knowledge and skills concrete in this shifting terrain? We need to develop social work's capital in these discourses we find ourselves. What is our capital? What do we offer? And this question is becoming more urgent. But I also say, and I want to argue, that social work registration is the time to start having these conversations. And perhaps it actually might enable us to come together and answer these questions. So it is our time for professional recognition in the form of registration. And South Australia is offering this chance. This is a beginning, but it will actually require collaborative effort from every stakeholder, including educators, employers, and social workers. So I want to go through each piece of this puzzle on the screen and explain why they matter and how they can shape social work to articulate its worth, which needs to be valuing public safety and those we actually engage with, particularly when they're at their most vulnerable. So I'm going to start with the first piece of the puzzle, which is title protection. So we know that a reoccurring theme in support of registration has been the protection of the title of social worker through restricting the use to suitably qualified workers. So title protection will ensure that any person who refers to themselves as a social worker or is employed as a social worker must be registered. Moreover, title protection will provide the community with greater confidence that those working in the role have the appropriate training, skills and competence and are subject to continuing professional development and disciplinary oversight. In short, title protection stops anyone calling themselves social workers when working in the human service sector, which unfortunately has been happening for a long time. This is not to criticise the workforce across the human and social service sector, but to point out that when there is no title protection and political, social, institutional and market drivers influencing the sector, this is what happens. So title protection is part of the broader ethical framework that governs professions. It builds and maintains public trust, and it becomes clear in law who can and cannot use a professional designation. So a title also supports work and workforce integrity. It ensures clarity that qualified professionals are employed to do something, be known for something, because they are employed under that title. If you just read the quote in italics up on the screen, that point is also being made through a person in a lived experience network that was part of our wider consultation around understanding registration for social workers. So title protection is one piece of the puzzle. The second piece of the puzzle I want to talk through with you is work protection. So when you think of other professions, you know what they do, the work they're regulated to do. So if I say a chiropractor, These are professionals who diagnose and treat musculoskeletal disorders, particularly those relating to the spine. If I say an occupational therapist, we know these are professionals who help people improve their ability to perform daily activities. If I say a paramedic, these are professionals who provide emergency medical care and transport. We know that psychologists are professionals who study mental processes and behaviour and provide therapy for mental health issues, and I could go on. For example, our lawyers, they provide legal services representing clients in legal matters, giving legal advice and appearing in court. So when you talk about other professionals, you know what they do. That's their work, that's protected. So what is our work? What are we trying to protect? The Social Workers Registration Act of 2021 provided the opportunity to define this piece of work to be protected by social workers. So in trying to define this work, it was important here in the South Australian context to honour the coroner reports, particularly for Chloe Valentine and Ebony Simone Napier, which highlighted the following areas of concern in relation to the capacities of the workforce in which social workers are largely present. These reports found largely that there was issues with the ability to clearly name issues, implications and potential consequences. There was not a willingness or ability to have difficult conversations. There was failure to recognise patterns over time and cumulative harm. There was overreach, inadequately grounded conclusions. There was failure to accurately and consistently document assessments, decisions, consultations and actions. There was a lack of understanding and interpretation and use of relevant legislation and associated tools. So when reading this feedback and these observations, you can see that there is an expectation here about a piece of work that the public expect social workers should be able to do. This reflects the specific and the high-risk nature of the work which the public would reasonably expect to be undertaken by a regulated professional. So the protection of social work services or the work relates directly to the public safety, ensuring that high-stakes work with the most vulnerable people is only done by people who are suitably educated, experienced and engaged in professional continuing development and supervision. The ability to regulate people undertaking social work services also means that if found to be unsuitable, they can be prevented from doing this work or conditions can be placed on their practice. In our definition, which is up on the screen, we have also included exclusions. So exclusions have been put in place to recognise the existing accreditation, regulation and other arrangements for other professionals already doing this work. So your other allied health professionals or those who are regulated, for example, under the counselling associations or federations. So social work is going to be held to the same standard and regulated to the same standard to do this work. So when you protect work, you are setting clear boundaries around who is recognised as part of the profession, and only those with accredited education, practice training and ongoing professional development can do this work and use the title. Hence, education and training really matter. The qualifications matter. The qualifications to do the work is then an eligibility criteria for registration. I want to also acknowledge that here in the South Australian context, the Alexander Report of 2022, Trusting Culture, a review of child protection in South Australia, affirmed this. They affirmed the value of a social work qualification to do the work. And so, but with this affirmation, the Alexander Report also pointed out that at the moment, the current workforce or the workforce needs formal training and skills in critical reasoning, analysis and decision making. Hence, again, the definition and the competencies I want to discuss with you. But when you have title protection, when you have work protection, what you also, and you're recognising a qualification, what you need is a scope of practice. You need a common occupation, and this is the scope of practice, which makes our third piece of the puzzle that I wanted to talk through with you. So the scope of practice sets out the kind of work social workers do, and it actually encapsulates the breadth of social work, including its values, its knowledge, skills, and its approach. What the description does is it also outlines identity, and so the values, knowledge, and skills that are to be taught to social workers. So when we say things like in our scope of practice, or you'll see from the coroner's reports or the Alexander Review, or even the definition of the Federation of Social Workers, when we say things like that social work is driven by a need to challenge and change structures and conditions that marginalise or exclude or oppress, promote cohesion and empowerment, this actually needs to be taught. This needs to be unpacked. What are the values, knowledge, skills required for this? Or when social work claims that we have respect for inherent worth and dignity, human rights, social justice, what do we mean by this as a profession? How do you think about this critically and insightfully? What knowledge do we use? What knowledge do we bring when we are understanding these things, and why? So when we say social workers require a high degree of skill in critical thinking or self-awareness as a profession and as individuals, how do you actually teach that? How do you develop that? How do you reward that in employment practices? When we say relationship-based, that social work is relationship-based, as soon as you say that, interpersonal and communication skills become really key. How do we hold people to a high standard in their interpersonal and communication skills? We understand systems. We understand the environmental impacts. We want to work with complexity and uncertainty. So how do you explain them and embrace this and teach this? So the scope of practice becomes really important. It is our base to understand who we are and what we do. Social work services also needs to be taught and maintained inside this scope of practice through CPD and supervision. So your title, your protection of work, and now the scope of practice, these are all exceptional and important pieces of regulation. We require a regulatory standard, though, to be maintained, to be able to fulfil these three elements. And with standards comes conduct and competency, like every other profession that's regulated. And so I'm now going to move to the fourth piece of the puzzle, which regulators are required to develop, and that is conduct and competency. So the question of how do you maintain high professional standards to ensuring professional accountability and safeguarding the public interests? You as a regulator are asked to prepare the codes of conduct and competencies. This is what the South Australian legislation requires us to do. This is what AHPRA would require us to do. This is what's required of the teachers when they are registered. Every profession is required to have a code of conduct and competence. Competencies articulate profession-specific knowledge, skills and values in relation to the work performed. So the conduct and competencies reflect the scope of practice and the social work service definition we're trying to protect. Competencies and conduct highlight the integration of knowledge, values and skills. And when you put these things together, they need to equal a social work identity, because this is what social workers sign up for, how they know themselves and their place in the wider sector. It is about a standard, what the public would reasonably expect. What would students reasonably expect when they sign up to do a social work degree? What would employers reasonably expect when they employ a social worker? So competencies are not tied to a particular role or setting, but rather are transferable across situations and contexts. As interrelated and transferable sets of knowledge, skills and values, competencies construct a competent social worker. The Code of Conduct sets out a base expectation of behaviour and practice that constitute the core requirements for professional, safe and quality service. How one conducts themselves expresses the specific identity and values of the social work profession. So, competencies and conducts are the standards which performance can be assessed. And that becomes really important for social work education, and it becomes really important when concerns and complaints come into the regulator. So the last two pieces of the puzzle. So the main pieces we've gone through are title and work protection, which the scope of practice encompasses. How do you hold people to account in working in that scope of practice? You need conduct and competency, but you also require supervision and ongoing continuing professional development. And these are also very critical components of an effective professional regulation for several key reasons. So firstly, in terms of registering social workers, what continuing professional development and supervision do is that it ensures safe and competent practice. So just remember, regulation aims to protect the public by ensuring professionals deliver safe, ethical and effective services. And so supervision and CPD are argued in terms of, or the assumption is that these things help professionals maintain and update their knowledge, skills and judgment, thereby reducing the risk of harm and improving outcomes. So it's continual learning. Also, that supervision provides time for a structured space to reflect on practice, to receive feedback, to navigate complex ethical or emotional challenges. And so it is about reflection and staying up to date with the new research and the evolving practice of social work. These two pieces of regulation also ensure or embed accountability into work practices. So supervision creates a formal process where professionals are accountable for their decision-making and conduct. It can help support transparency and early identification of practice concerns before they escalate. And CPD, together with supervision, fosters a culture of learning, lifelong learning. It's about innovation, responsiveness, critical thinking can be developed, adaptability and the application of evidence-based approaches. Together, these two pieces of the puzzle also strengthen professional identity and ethics. These things can be discussed through professional development and supervision. It keeps identity and ethics on the agenda in everyday work practices. And it also enhances workforce sustainability and well-being. So research over time has shown that CPD, in particular supervision, plays a really important role in, emotional support, burnout prevention, resilience, especially in really high demanding fields of practice. So a well-supported workforce is more likely to stay in the profession and reduce this turnover, ensuring some kind of stability and an experienced workforce that wants to stay and grow and learn. So the last piece of the puzzle that I want to talk through in terms of the opportunities of regulation in facing the challenging constructions around social work is the very important role that the role of higher education play. So without these pieces of the puzzle, that is title, work protection, conduct and competencies, and an expectation of CPD and supervision, unfortunately, social work academics in Australia and New Zealand have started to argue that without these things, social work is being constructed as simple. Anyone can do it, rather than a professional occupation, requiring analytical and reflective skills, as well as values and practice knowledge bases that explains the complex, multifaceted structural and social situations we find ourselves working in, where power is exercised daily in the lives of vulnerable peoples. This is complex work that requires particular competencies. Without it, social work is being seen as something anyone can do or simple. So academics in Australia and New Zealand are starting to argue that social work is not just a desire to help people, it's not care work, it's a political occupation. It's committed to transformation and upholding of human rights that requires a complex understanding of power relations across all levels of society. And so what I'm arguing also is that regulation offers the opportunity to actually really commit to this in a coherent manner. This delineation is not to offend or ignore the wide and varied composition of the workforce that's represented in the social and human service sector. Instead, what I'm saying is regulation offers the opportunity to state social work as a disciplined group of individuals who adhere to particular ethical standards and who hold themselves out as and are accepted by the public as possessing special knowledge and skills in a widely recognised body of learning derived from research, education and training at the highest level, and who are prepared to apply this knowledge and exercise these skills in the interests of others. So setting a human rights agenda and social justice agenda through social work is significant politically, particularly in a civil society, and raises the profile of work for the most vulnerable in a society. So if we say as a discipline and a profession, this is our title, this is the work that we're expected to do, and these are the conduct and competencies expected of social workers, they are foundational. They then require teaching. They require consistency and clarity for the next generation of social workers. So what I'm saying is there is naturally a connection between regulation and the role of higher education. The board's role includes prescribing qualifications which lead to registration and investigating registered social workers to assess whether their conduct or competence is appropriate. And so the board needs to be sure at the point of registering someone if they are competent to work in that profession, thus the legislative responsibility for the board to prescribe the qualifications which can lead to registration. Further, if there is concern about someone's competence, it's the regulator's role to investigate this and assess the professional's competence against the standards expected of a registered professional. The board is therefore looking at both what qualifies someone to become a social worker and holding the profession to the standard expected of them. The board has a due diligence obligation to ensure that whatever qualification is prescribed are appropriate and sufficient to lead to registration. That is, how can the Social Workers Registration Board be confident that a person with a prescribed qualification will be able to practice appropriately as a social worker? So with the opportunity to define social work services within a scope of practice and set the expectations of a standard of practice that only social workers can do because of their training, education and experience, the regulator has a responsibility to exercise care and diligence in defining unprofessional conduct and incompetence. So it is through strong education standards that consistency, relevancy and accountability through accreditation becomes possible to set a high expectation of a standard of practice, an expectation of professionalisation. The regulator and higher education providers need to work productively to ensure that graduates achieve the knowledge, skills and values required to be fit for registration, and more importantly, understand the privilege of providing social work services and their obligations should they become registered. So they're the pieces of the puzzle. Before I finish, now that I've gone through these important pieces, 6 pieces of the puzzle of regulation of social work and how they can enable us to grasp a social work identity into the future, I also just want to acknowledge that this is going to take a long-term strategy to be able to achieve this. And by highlighting the role of higher education and the importance of the qualification during this presentation, you might be asking yourself, why has the Social Workers Registration Board proposed experience pathways and different registration types as part of its model? That is, people will be able to register for doing social work services, that protected piece of work, without a qualification. And so I want to answer this for you. To uplift a profession or practice is going to take a while, and it actually requires a long-term strategy and investment. Regulation affirms a collective identity, embedding the profession within systems of governance, education and public service, therefore improving public trust and legitimacy. Regulation is a powerful lever for professional maturity, workforce development and public value, but it's going to take a while. So without strategic work to amplify and evolve the profession alongside regulation, I'm afraid that the impact will be limited. Hence, we need to do this work together as a sector and understand and work within this systemic terrain that we actually find ourselves. Remember, the market has had powerful consequences that we need to now work through. The Social Workers Registration Board, also in recognition of the vast and diverse composition of the social and human service sector, understood that employment practices have been established over time that have contributed to the blurring of boundaries of social work. And we know this, that it is commonplace to see an advertising of positions into social work and the human service sector where a bachelor or a master's of social work is viewed as equivalent to a community service certificate, vocation and education and training and lived experience. Regulating only those workers at this point in time with a social work qualification and not those others, those without qualifications doing this work, would leave high areas of high risk work and the people performing it without scrutiny. So we've just got to be careful of this. So instead of protecting vulnerable people by ensuring that suitable people can undertake this highly specialised work at this point in time, could or would create a disincentive for employers to hire qualified and registered social workers. Regulating through the qualification alone at this point in time also means that those with social work qualifications would be subject to higher standards and regulatory oversight than their non-qualified counterparts. In effect, the work and therefore the public would no longer be protected, and those with qualifications would be held to a higher standard while their counterparts could continue to work without oversight or accountability. That's why the importance of protecting social work services, the work, was highlighted by the Joint Committee on the Social Workers Registration Bill, noting the potential for employers to circumvent registration by simply changing an employee's job title from social worker, for example, to case manager, thereby avoiding registration. So that's why we need to think about how we're protecting not just the title, but a piece of work. And Section 24 of the Act provides South Australia with the opportunity to do this, and also to prevent the circumvention of registration of social work. So in the submission to the committee, also at the time, the Chief Executive of New Zealand's Association of Social Workers talked about their experience of circumvention of registration and actually welcomed Section 24 to stop this practice. In short, they said that if you only protect the title social worker and or the qualification, you cannot protect the work, the very work that has been criticised in public inquiries. This would leave the regulator powerless to stop unsuitable people from doing this work. The qualification represents the education and training that gives the board the confidence in someone's competence. While this is central to registration and this is the long-term strategy, it is something we cannot enforce immediately because it will have unintended consequences for social workers, the current workforce, for employers and the public. So we require a long-term strategy. So registering those who perform social work services without the qualification was also anticipated in the legislation. I would also like to say that other professions have done this as part of their journey into registration. So it's important to honour their contributions and enable growth through the pathways, and other professions have done this through provisional or limited registration. The Australian Association of Social Workers, I respect, has indicated that it does not support the inclusion of people without social work qualifications into the registration scheme. But in contrast, and we have heard this through our consultations as well, the Public Service Association asserts that while workers may not have the required qualification, they have extensive background working as social workers and are experienced and respected workers who should be recognised in the new scheme. I would also like to honour the words of an Aboriginal social work leader here in this state, April Laurie, who's also argued that non-qualified workforce should be provided with support and developed options to enable them to progress with their careers. The Act provides, therefore, an experience-based pathway to recognise prior experience in the delivery of social work services. This enables the regulation of this workforce at this point in time, and hence the capacity to protect social work services through provisional registration and pathways to full registration. It is this tailored approach that represents a fair and balanced strategy for individuals working in social work services and potentially impacted by the scheme. And granting limited registration where appropriate ensures continuity of services by safeguarding the workforce from immediate impacts while incorporating these workers into the regulatory framework of the scheme. This will promote consistent, high-quality service delivery across the sector, as outlined in the diagram. I also want to note that anyone who was regulated in these types of pathways are expected to all do CPD, expected to be supervised if you're doing this protected piece of work. The only people who can claim the title are those with full registration, particularly with the qualification. Other regulators have gone on a similar journey, and you will see these categories often reflected, for example, in the Teachers Registration Board's scheme. So, with all those pieces of the puzzle, with an explanation of and a call for a long-term strategy and an understanding of this long-term strategy, I now want to close with some thoughts. In terms of regulation, actually allows the profession now time to reflect on its scope of practice and the conduct and competencies required, presenting in turn possibilities for reinvigorating education standards. Grasping this opportunity, though, requires commitment to exploration, discussion, respectful debate and collegiality, while acknowledging the challenges associated with the shifting relationships between the association, the heads of council, and now the Social Workers Registration Board. But furthermore, it requires a strategic and coordinated approach to engaging with politicians and parliamentary processes, and this is going to require unity. I'm afraid that if we cannot evidence our identity and unity to politicians and the sector, the vision for professional capital and trust and accountability to the public will be lost. South Australia has provided a significant opportunity for social work, and we cannot waste it. The political, social, institutional and market forces are evolving fast around us and demanding that we articulate our value and be clear in what it is that we do. Other professions are required to do this, and it is demanded of them. So now it is our turn. I also just need to name my concern with pushing for AHPRA. If this is what the profession want to do, I will fully support it. If this happens in the complexity review, I will fully support it. However, it is also okay to say, is AHPRA the only option we have? And with the complexity we find ourselves and with the world around us, it is okay to pause and ask, what does this all mean for us? And how do we understand social work today? What model of national registration do we want? And we can form it to meet the professional needs and the needs of the diverse individuals, groups and communities we work with. We just need to come together to do this. There are alternative messages in the public domain that question social work being regulated by a health model. For example, this actually did not work in England, and social work needed to be taken out of the health regulator. In the complexity review into AHPRA, it's also showing signs that AHPRA has a lot on its plate and that social work is not actually seen as pure health. And as a profession, AHPRA recognises that social work crosses many sectors, and perhaps it's best for social work to form its own national regulation that suits this. I emphasise again, it is only us that can govern our functioning in a durable way, determining our success in this complex environment. But this requires the collective to come together. That is the association, the regulator, the council, universities, major employers. And I'm arguing registration is that opportunity for the coming of together. It provides us with an opportunity to think about and sustain the future of the profession. Registration will provide title protection, but more significantly and for the first time, it provides the opportunity to define protected work, social work services that only registered social workers are permitted to do, and that's because of their education and training. When you protect social work services such as assessing, analysing, intervening and evaluating, and claiming the value of a holistic understanding of individuals, families, groups and communities for the purpose of and saying we do identify complexity, risk, danger, trauma and harm. This will enable us as social workers to speak with authority, and it gives legitimacy to such work that understands and names people in their contexts. Regulation gives legitimacy to the social justice agenda to better protect the public and increase accountability for harmful or socially unacceptable practices on behalf of social workers, and actually stops those who have historically held themselves out to be social workers from continuing to do so. The effect of this is that the public can be confident that a social worker is competent and safe to practice. Regulation is a vital start and it drives ongoing improvement as it encourages quality practice, which influences quality service delivery to those most vulnerable. Regulation can provide us with a social justice identity that we want to be known for, and we need social justice conversations and drivers in this current society we find ourselves living in. Please take a moment, if you are interested in the references I've used, please take a moment to look on the website where the materials of the social work service definition and the scope of practice is provided for you, as well as the conduct and competencies that have been made for the purposes of regulation. Thank you so much for your time.